He's opened a meeting with incoming Insurance Commissioner Tim Temple about some of his ideas related to the insurance crisis.
Sabrina Wilson has more from the newsroom.
I talked to Tim Temple last week, and he said he won't continue current Insurance Commissioner Jim Donald's policy of prohibiting insurance companies from raising rates more than once a year. I asked the governor about that today. Now, after Hurricanes Laura and Ida devastated parts of Louisiana, some insurers left the state or went insolvent, and many homeowners are seeing premiums skyrocket. Incoming Insurance Commissioner Tim Temple thinks Louisiana has to have a friendlier regulatory environment. Would you favor allowing insurers to raise rates more than once a year?
The law says that an insurance company can go and seek rate relief, rate change, as often as they want, as long as it's actuarially justified, that it's not excessive, that it's rate adequate, and it doesn't discriminate. So the law says you can do that as often as you want. The current administration says you can only do it once every 12 months.
What will the Tim Temple administration say about that?
We'll follow the law.
So Tim Temple is someone that I've known for a while. He is very serious and he's very thoughtful. And I guess like all of us, that doesn't mean he's always right. I would be very concerned about some of the things that he is saying would help with the insurance market in Louisiana. It seems to me that would tilt the things too much in favor of the insurance companies and away from the insureds, the consumers in Louisiana, who have been left high and dry too often by their insurers. But I'm certainly somebody who's willing to sit down with Tim and get his ideas.
Tim Temple says he's already been talking with state lawmakers and the candidates for governor about insurance reform. He wants there to be a special legislative session early in January. Now, Edwards says he will remain a Louisiana citizen after leaving office in January, so he certainly cares about the insurance crisis. He was in town today to talk about state investments in higher education.